Warm welcome. My name is Christer Nylander. I'm a chair of Åhlin-institutet, a liberal think tank, founded in the name of Bertil Ohlin, a great liberal leader and liberal politician, but also a great economist. Actually won the Nobel Prize in 1977, mostly for his finding in trade policies. But although I think he's one of the most interesting person, this night is not about him. It's about democracy, and we are very pleased to arrange this together with Fri Tanke, publisher, and therefore I leave the floor to Christer Sturmark. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Very welcome to this evening. Thank you for joining us for this evening. We do a lot of talk shows here, as some of you might know. This evening is a little bit different, and we're going to talk about quite serious questions and problems in the world today. My name is Christer Sturmark. I'm the CEO of Fri Tanke. And we are extremely happy to work together with the Bertil Ohlin Institute to arrange this evening. We are gathered here tonight to explore some of the most pressing questions of our time. The challenges and the future of liberal democracy, individual freedoms, human rights in the United States, in Europe, and across the globe. And we are very fortunate to have with us two remarkable thinkers and voices in this conversation tonight. But we are dividing this evening into two sessions, into two parts. The first act, and then we have a break for about 15 minutes, and then we have the second session. So right now, I will just like to introduce our keynote speaker who will talk during the first session, and after that, in the second session, we will have a discussion. So right now, I want to introduce the first speaker. He's an American writer and essayist, a writer for the New Yorker, the magazine that I'm quite sure some of you have read, a fantastic magazine. Since the 80s, he's contributed essays, criticism, memoir, fiction. He's also the author of 9 books. I can't mention them all, but one of them is called in English 1,000 Small Sanities, and that has actually been translated into Swedish. It's called 1,000 små framsteg in Swedish. But he's also a movie star. Those of you who saw the major movie Tar in cinemas 2 years ago or something like that, with Kate Blanchett in the leading role, there you could see him play the role as himself, which is a quite cool thing to do in a major Hollywood movie. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my dear friend Adam Gopnik.
Thank you. Thank you, Christer. Thank you. Thank you, Christer, and thank you all. The appearance in Tar was indeed a fascinating case where I was not playing myself as such, but impersonating a person I sometimes impersonate on stage. I often do conversations on stage with well-known people, and that version of myself is not myself, but an invented persona that I project. He's much nicer, he's interested in other people, he's a kind and social person, which I am not. And so for the purposes of the film, I had to impersonate my own impersonation of myself. There were so many meta levels gathered at one time that it's amazing that the film did not explode. Tonight, I want to talk to you seriously. It's always a joy to be here in Stockholm, to be among friends and among kindred spirits. And one's instincts, social instincts, and instincts as a speaker are always to lighten the difficulties, make a few jokes, try and soften the hard truths of a subject. Tonight, I am afraid I cannot do that, or I cannot do it in good conscience. We live in a moment of extraordinary crisis, and I want to address that crisis as directly and as specifically as I can. I prepared a long and finished lecture on these subjects, but I will spare you reading that lecture. There is nothing deadlier in life than being read a lecture by a speaker, but I hope you will forgive me if I occasionally consult it to remind myself of where I'm going and what I want to say. The theme of my book, A Thousand Small Sanities, which I was hugely flattered to have published here in Sweden, in Swedish, as indeed it was published in Italian and in Polish and in Hungarian, all of the languages of particularly endangered democracies. It was also published in American, the most endangered democracy of all, perhaps. The theme of that book was not that liberalism, liberal democracy, call it what we will, republicanism, humanism, was not that this was a historical movement that was foreordained to conquer and vanquish and win. Some of you may remember that around the year 2000, Francis Fukuyama proposed the end of history. Some of you recall that book. The idea that history had resolved itself in liberal democracy and that there was no rejecting, there was no resisting liberal democracy. It was an idea that Fukuyama took very much from Hegel, the German philosopher, the idea that there is a plot in history, a direction history is trending, and our job as thinkers and as citizens is to embrace that inevitability. Well, right now we are suffering from what I think of as a Hegelian hangover, because clearly that belief, that faith in a plot in history unfolding in the direction of and to the advantage of liberal democracy has proven to be entirely false. I remember so well spending the eve of the millennium in Paris, where I lived at the time, and feeling that the American empire of culture and finance and ideology had encircled the world. I don't know if many of you remember that night when the Eiffel Tower sparkled and the London wheel turned and we went from Hong Kong to New York and beyond, and there was a sense, if not of global unity, then at least, let us say, of global hegemony on the part of certain core American values. We live in a radically different moment, for good or ill, now. But the point of A Thousand Small Sanities was not to argue for inevitability, not to argue for historical certainty, but just the opposite. To think of liberalism, of liberal democracy, as a permanent feature of human history, of Western history certainly, a particular dream of pluralism and tolerance that had existed at least since antiquity, that had been instantiated in fragile and uncertain ways in many societies along the way, and that had finally, in the past 100 or so years, achieved a kind of apotheosis, and one in which I will say without apology, in which it had been extraordinarily successful. The societies of North America, Canada, where I come from originally, of the United States, of Western Europe, of Australia, and New Zealand, and indeed of many of the countries of Eastern Europe that had joined that legion, had produced societies of a pluralism, a prosperity, a broad extension of rights to sexual and racial minorities, a society imperfectly egalitarian, to be sure, but nonetheless closer to those dreams of pluralism, social peace, and prosperity than any other societies that poor humanity had suffered through on our long march forward. those societies that dream of liberal democratic pluralism is under assault now, however, in a way that it has not been at least since the 1930s, and in some respects, as it has not been forever. The other argument I wanted to make in A Thousand Small Sanities, and one I make again and again, is that if we want to find the core, the guiding idea of that liberal democratic ideal that descends to us from John Stuart Mill and from Karl Popper, from the founding fathers of the United States, from the founding makers of the European Union, if we had to find one core idea, it is not an idea about policy. Most American progressives, as perhaps you know, look to Sweden and to Scandinavia as a model of the kind of social democratic state that they dream of. But the crucial part about the liberal democratic ideal is not simply that we arrive at policy that we love, but something deeper than that, that we believe that arguments about policy can be subsumed into a pluralistic politics, that we can accept the wild oscillation of ideology and of individuals in power without losing our faith in the system, the infrastructure that allows that oscillation to take place. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are just as much parts of the story, in some respects heroes of the story of liberalism, as Olof Palme or Barack Obama. It is not the individual or the specific social policy that we value. It is above all two simple ideas: the idea that we can have oscillation in ideology, sometimes of an extreme kind, that take place without social violence. And secondly, and perhaps most important of all, the idea that we can speak back to power without fear. Such a simple idea that we can speak back to power without fear, but if we consider the totality of human history, how rare that is. If we consider the totality of the planet as it exists right now, the idea that we can speak strongly and radically against existing power without fear for our lives or safety or security, that is one of the strangest, most original, most quixotic, most improbable of all human ambitions and of all human achievements. And I will say emphatically and without apology that it is one that until very recently had been in liberal democracies largely achieved. And yet now we are at a time when that understanding, that consensus, if you like, is under assault in almost every country. We see it in France, my adopted country, with the rise of the extreme nationalist right. We see it, I am told, here in Sweden, with also the rise of an extreme right-wing populism. We certainly have witnessed it in Italy. We saw it in the United Kingdom with the rise of Brexit and the growth of Nigel Farage's parties, and we see it above all, and perhaps most tragically, in my own homeland of the United States with the recrudescence and the reappearance of Trumpism as a movement. I wrote a piece just before the last election in the United States about the potential consequences of Trumpism, and I posited it as a kind of dialogue between a Trump minimalist and a Trump maximalist. The Trump minimalist, who was actually my beloved editor, in the piece spoke for continuity against hysteria, not to exaggerate the risks of Trump back in power. The Trump maximalist, who was myself, said, on the contrary, that we could almost guarantee that if Trump were reelected, all of the insurrectionists of January 6th would be pardoned, not just the nonviolent ones, but the most violent ones, that Ukraine and the cause of Ukrainian independence would certainly be betrayed on behalf of Putin. And I even extended that prescience to saying, and some of you may recognize this, that both Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel would be forced off the air within 6 months. every one of those pessimistic anticipations and prophecies has turned out to be true. We live in a grave moment and in a profoundly worrying time. But if there are two parts of that story that I find particularly frightening, or one part at least that I find frightening and worth some dissection as a subject, a topic to address tonight, there's another side of it that I find vaguely comforting that I want to share with you as well. So let me talk first, if I may, about what I think is, in some respects, the worst and most frightening aspect of what's happening in the United States right now, and then talk after about what I think, without false or undue optimism, may indeed be, if not a remedy, then at least a path forward. The worst part of what we're experiencing in the United States right now, it seems to me, is the secession of the elite technocratic and entrepreneurial classes. That's not something that I think could have easily been anticipated. We are seeing, grosso modo in large, the transformation of our plutocratic class into an oligarchic class. Our plutocrats are becoming oligarchs. Now, what do I mean by that? Inevitably, in any free market capitalist society like the United States, a great deal of the wealth of the society will be captured by a small number of people. And we can argue and debate, and I'm sure we will tonight, how one remedies that, whether one should remedy that, whether the advantages of having a dynamic entrepreneurial society outweigh the disadvantages of having a highly unequal society. These are all questions that can be raised and answered. But in the past in the United States, the plutocratic element has been, on the whole, philanthropic. If you look at the plutocrats of the first Gilded Age, as we sometimes call it, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Fricks, the Carnegies, they made their money through the exploitation of the helpless. They engaged in strike breaking and striker shooting. I make no case for their particular virtues, for they had few of them. But whether out of a feeling that at a certain moment arthritis turns into altruism, or whether out of simple fear, they did build the cultural infrastructure that still ornaments American life. If you come to New York City and you go from the Metropolitan Opera to Carnegie Hall to the Metropolitan Museum to the Morgan Library to the Frick Collection to all of the great Carnegie libraries, including the New York Public Library, those are all products of that first Gilded Age. They may have been plutocrats, but they were not Philistines. They tended, on the whole, to have a certain sense of social responsibility, however malevolently motivated at times, and they built broad social institutions that were ones in which a pluralistic culture could persist and exist. I have written at length, as some of you may know, about Central Park in New York City as one of the key institutions of that kind. A philanthropic enterprise on the part of the New York entrepreneurial class right on the eve of the American Civil War, which was built by Frederick Olmsted to be the model of what a pluralistic society ought to be. It has no grand allée. It has no fence to keep you out. There is no hierarchy of spaces. It is an open park meant for people through which generation and generation of immigrant New Yorkers has passed to remake it in their own image and to learn the value of play as the pedestal of a pluralistic politics. Those are real accomplishments. They may have been plutocrats, but they were not Philistines. But in America right now, we're seeing a very different and frightening declension. We're seeing that same class, which only a few years ago was struggling to play a plutocratic, a classic American plutocratic role, now playing an oligarchic role. What's the difference between the plutocrat and the oligarch? Well, it seems to me exactly that a plutocrat is someone who has seized, fairly or unfairly, a disproportionate share of the society's wealth, and it can be through technological innovation with Facebook or Google or AI. But a plutocrat, as I say, historically keeps a certain distance from the political center, does the political work through intermediaries, political parties, and political ambassadors, and tends to be at a remove from power, even if attempting inevitably to manipulate it at a distance. The oligarch, on the other hand, is necessarily immediately in the court of the autocrat. The oligarch has to be within the court of the oligarch because it's only through that close proximity that the oligarch can be sure that he is still in favor with the autocrat. It's only through proximity that the oligarch can be certain that he is not being stabbed in the back and betrayed by the other oligarchs. And the oligarch cannot play a philanthropic role, cannot build a sphere of institutions independent of the autocrat, because to do that is to put yourself in competition with the autocrat as the master of a sphere outside his control. And as a consequence, in the classic oligarchic countries like Russia, we see no cultural initiative. And in America now, for the first time, we're seeing in that same once plutocratic class an oligarchic role. Give you a simple example I will attach a name to. Jeff Bezos of Amazon is someone whom I actually know. I have dined at his table. I have camped out with him over a weekend. And 20 years ago, he was attempting to play a classic philanthropic role. He was opening his home to a variety of intellectuals and artists and scientists to hold conversations. He bought the Washington Post in classic philanthropic manner to try and support a great American institution that had fallen on hard times, gave it the noble title, Democracy Dies in Darkness. But that is not the Jeff Bezos that we see before us now. The new Jeff Bezos, responding to the stringencies and the exigencies of a new kind of autocracy, feels himself compelled to change the editorial line of the Washington Post so that it will do nothing that will offend the autocrat, including cleansing the paper of columnists and editorialists and absolutely stopping the paper from its traditional role of endorsing the candidate of its choice, and in effect paying what amounts to a bribe to the autocrat to stay in power. That's a very different social role, and the declension of plutocracy into oligarchy is, I think, one of the most frightening and evident features of American life right now. We saw it quite clearly with the rise and fall of Elon Musk within the world of Trumpism, first playing a role that seemed semi-equal and then crashing down. And very significantly, as you may have noted, though Musk for one moment tried to tussle with, to wrestle with Trump, he quickly withdrew. The oligarch's world of sphere of potential action is limited to the window he might be near that's on a high floor. That's one way, it seems to me, in which, in a very frightening way, the United States has become deformed in the past few years. And there's another way, too, that's almost metaphysical or mystical, but I'm sure many of you have experienced it, and it's part of the tragic history of Europe in the 1930s. That is, there is an enormous tropism, an enormous magnetism, an attraction of whole classes of people, including intellectuals, towards power, towards men particularly of authority, men who project authority. It is the easiest thing in the world for our moral nerve to collapse and for us to say, well, I don't approve and I don't agree, but look, he, whomever it is, Mussolini, Hitler, let us say, he gets things done. He's someone of action. He's someone of authority. Democratic states are necessarily ones that are flower with 1,000 small sanities, not with one big leader. And yet we see all around us the nerve and morale of people collapsing in the face, the image of authority. That seems to be a deeply human instinct, and it's frightening when one sees it happen over and over again as institutions that once stood for liberty, for free expression, for their own autonomy, collapse one after another in the face, the staring face of the autocrat. It's often said, of course, that the growth of the new autocracy in Europe or in America is the inevitable consequence of what preceded it. And you hear this all the time in America. People who ought to know better than to lose their nerve and their will in the face of autocracy, in part because, of course, they will not benefit from it in the long run at all. I mentioned the new oligarchic class in America. But one of the most startling things about it is that all of those people, the tech giants, the tech bros who come out for meetings at the White House, it shocks me that all of them, without exception, were able to make their fortunes because they lived in a rule of law society. When Jeff Bezos was starting Amazon, he did not have to pay a bribe to Bill Clinton, who was president at the time. When the brilliant immigrants who started Google, they did not have to pay baksheesh to the political boss. The rule of law society in America is imperfect. Capitalism claims its depredations, but on the whole, that is true. The United States has been a successful entrepreneurial society because people can expect contracts to be honored, the courts to be more or less honest, bribes an unnecessary part of building an enterprise. All of that changes, and yet the people who have benefited from that system seem disinclined to protect the very system that made their fortunes. That's part of the tragedy, exactly, of our time. It's certainly true that in a small way, one of the causes of the rise of autocracy in Europe and in America is a profound sense of dislocation, profound sense of uncertainty. And if one took a God's eye view of the past 50 years, indeed of the past 100 years, one of the things that would strike us is that we've lived through a time of enormous social change, and that inevitably there will be a powerful reaction to that social change. One of the things I like to do, and this will show you what a profoundly nerdy turn of mind I have, is that when I cannot sleep at night, which is most nights, I sometimes watch the Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960 on YouTube. And they're astonishing to watch, the Kennedy-Nixon debates, because first of all, these two men, and I grew up in a liberal family that admired Kennedy and despised Nixon, but Nixon is a model of rationality, serious debate, shouts no slogans, spits no insults. That's impressive in itself as an example of democratic decorum. But even more interesting is that issues that seem pressing and vital to us right now would have been completely outside the sphere of possibility in 1960. No one could have asked Senator Kennedy, what do you think of homosexual marriage? Have we taken it too far, or is it just right? It would have been an unaskable question at that time. And yet now we live within a dispensation in which we, in the United States, to a remarkable degree, take gay marriage very much for granted, as indeed is the case in Europe. You could not have imagined asking someone in that debate, what do you think of increased rights on sports teams for transvestites, as they would have been called at that point? It's an unaskable question at that moment. And so seeing that index, we see how wildly different the society we live in now is from the society that we lived in then. And I don't even mention even more profound transformations like the Civil Rights Revolution or the Feminist Revolution. We have lived in a time, through a time, of remarkable social transformation. And in one way, it's simply predictable and inevitable that there will be a reaction against that transformation. But here Here I will say something to you that is almost taboo, that we are not allowed to say. It is part of the burden, part of the responsibility of liberal speakers, of the liberal imagination, of the liberal conscience, always to take responsibility for other people's bad conduct. When we see the rise of Trumpism, the rise of the extreme right in Europe, we're always inclined to say, you must understand the root causes, the root complaints, the economic anxiety, fear of immigration that pushes those things forward. And we're inclined to think that the revolt against liberalism is a rational revolt against the failures of the liberal state. I will say the taboo thing now, which is that it seems to me that what we're experiencing is an irrational revolt against the manifest successes of the liberal state and of liberal democracy. That the things that we have altered and changed are all for the good. That the liberal democratic hegemony has done nothing except make a better, more pluralistic world. And that the revolt against it, far from being rooted in the specifics of recent history, are much, much more deeply rooted in, if I can use this old-fashioned expression, in the nature of humankind. I turn at this moment to one of my favorite books on the nature of democracy and on the possibilities of human spirit, Karl Popper's great book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, written in exile in New Zealand by an Austrian Jew in the 1940s. Popper was writing about Athenian democracy and its demise from the high period of Pericles to its declension into tyranny. And Popper's point, which I believe to be true now as it was then and as it was in the year 500 BC, is that open societies, liberal democracies, pluralistic regimes put enormous stress on their citizens. He called it the strain of civilization. And we might call it more simply the shock of the new and of the open. Every time we extend rights, every time we pursue a more pluralistic understanding of the human condition, we inevitably put an enormous strain on our communal, our tribal, our narrow instincts. And that struggle between those who believe in open societies, in broadly pluralist and ever-reforming social arrangements, against those who want, out of a desperate, emotional, understandable, but passionate need to retreat into the tribe, into the cave, into the closed and familiar. That is not a feature of 21st century history. That is a permanent feature of human history and can only be addressed as such. In that way, what I want to propose to you finally is that exactly what seems to be the worst facet of this crisis may be the path towards its resolution. And that is exactly its universality. We see traits of the same kind of authoritarian revolt in France, in Sweden, in the UK, as in America. And yet when we look at those societies, we can say right away that they have nothing in common in terms of their dispensation of social providence. I lived for many years in France, which is a model of a kind of benevolent welfare society that progressives in America can only dream of. And yet exactly the same kinds of political traits and the same rise of an authoritarian right appear in France, as appear in America, as appear in Sweden, as they do in Canada. That universality might seem terribly dispiriting, but I find it encouraging inasmuch exactly as it compels us to recognize that the struggle we're in is not a narrow struggle of one historical period, but a permanent struggle of our vision of what humanity is and can be. The struggle between pluralism and authoritarianism is the defining struggle of human societies. It will never end. History will never end. The liberal millennium will never arrive. We will be in constant and perpetual struggle over these values for as long as human beings exist. And we may lose. We have lost in the past. We may be right now at what I think of as a moment of Ciceronian crisis, thinking of Cicero, the great and eloquent spokesman for the Roman Republic, who lost his fight and ended with his hands and tongue cut out for having spoken for the Roman Republic. As imperfect a republic as our own, and yet one in which that central virtue of being able to speak to power without fear had existed for a long time. And then, when Cicero passed, existed no longer, and we went into 1,000 years of absolutism of one kind or another. The struggle between absolutism and humanism is a permanent one. It is not one that we can escape. It is not one that history itself will give us a path out of. It's one that we will have to engage in as an existential struggle for as long as there are human beings alive. What can we do? The one truth I think that perhaps we don't meditate on enough is that liberal democracies rest on two pillars, not just one. They rest on free and fair elections, of course. They rest on the rule of law, as I said before. But they rest just as much on Central Park. They rest just as much on the strength of civil society. They rest just as much on evenings like this one, on coffee houses where people of fundamentally different castes and creeds and backgrounds can come together for conversation. They rest on opera societies and glee clubs. And if you think I'm being frivolous or fanciful, remember that the great sociologist of democracy, Robert Putnam, when he went to study what it was that made democracies work, said it was the pre-existence of volunteer firefighting associations, of amateur opera clubs. It was people having the practice of coexisting with one another. That was the basis that made a democracy thrive. Not a constitution that could be obeyed or distorted at will. And that pillar of a liberal democracy, the pillar of civil society, the pillar of what Olmsted called in one of the most beautiful expressions I know, our commonplace civilization. Not our official political life, but the commonplace civilization which teaches us and trains us how to exist with people of radically different ideologies, radically different beliefs, radically different creeds, every day in a city like Stockholm or a city like New York. That is just as important a platform of liberal democracy as the actual functioning of our legal and electoral system. And that is the pedestal and the system that we can keep alive by our own volition and our own will every day if we choose to be unintimidated by power. I think so often of the brave women of Tehran who go from coffee house to coffee house simply to live and converse without having to be veiled. What they talk about can be completely apolitical. It can be without any dissension, but the act of talking, of looking in someone's eyes, as Levinas would say, is in itself political. And it is no accident that the religious police pursue them from coffee house to coffee house, shutting down one only to find another open. That engagement and that refusal to be intimidated in advance by autocracy is one that we can engage with when we simply walk outside the door and refuse our fears and live for our hopes and live for our concordance and communication with our fellow citizens. We have, in other words, to bear witness to our time in all its horror, and we have, if a cosmopolitan, secular, humanist Jew like myself can use this phrase, we have, above all, to keep the faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much. Adam Gopnik. You will see more of him very, very soon. And I have a lot of questions, of course, for you, Adam. But now, 10 minutes break. Fill your glasses, talk to each other, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Adam, please come up on stage. Welcome back. You can sit in the middle. And we also have another guest. She is professor of philosophy at Stockholm University, researching the philosophy of mind, language, epistemology. But beyond all these academic contributions, she is also a leading public intellectual voice in Sweden on the role of knowledge, truth, and reason in society. She is also a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and the Swedish Academy, which, in my opinion, thanks to her, it's cool to be a member there again. Please welcome Åsa Wikforss. Yes. Before we start, Åsa, have you decided who's going to get the Nobel Prize in Literature yet?
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
No. We're discussing. We're having this kind of very pluralistic, liberal discussion right now.
Okay. Is it a hard fight?
No. Debate.
Okay. Debate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
This is good, yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you about that more because I know that your lips are sealed. No, but seriously, Åsa, first I'd like to hear your reflections on what Adam said in his keynote speech.
Well, like I told him, he hit every note. I think it's a messy, big picture, but it's really important to bring some structure to it. And you did that in just the right way. And there were a couple of things that I think are absolutely key here. One is pluralism. We don't talk enough about that, but that is the essence of democracy. That is the idea that we disagree on all sorts of things, on values, on facts, on all sorts of things, and we have to live together, right? So democracy is this amazing, remarkable invention that where we disagree in a peaceful way, through arguments and debates and voting, and then we accept that we don't always get what we want, but that's okay because we can vote again. Pluralism is the fundamental thing. Now, I just wrote a text the other day about whether democracy is value-free. Because pluralism is, importantly, value pluralism, right? Yes. We have different ideas about the good life and the good society and what kind of person I want to be, what kind of person I want to marry and all that. Democracy allows for that, but it's not, so it's pluralistic in terms of values. And we can be quite apart from each other, like you were saying, you know, Reagan and Olof Palme and whatever. That's okay, because we know how to disagree. But in order to be able to disagree in a good way, we need some values, we need some fundamental values that underlies all this and makes it possible. And that is the values of tolerance and openness. And this is why the open society is such a key thing. And that, when you look at, which I've looked a lot at the political science now, of how democracies go under. And a really important driving factor is that, is anti-pluralistic movements that come in and say, no, these are the right values. These are it. And the people who don't endorse those values, those are our enemies, and they have no legitimate claim to power. That's how it goes. And the anti-pluralist parties are populist parties. It's the same thing, basically. It can be right-wing or left-wing populism. Right now, it's a lot of right-wing populism. But it's always harmful to democracy because it doesn't accept pluralism. And then when it comes into power, because it has the right values, it thinks, it will shut down opposition and opposing voices and media and academics.
And comedians.
And comedians. Precisely because they don't accept opposition and open debate, and they don't accept pluralism. So pluralism was key. That was a really good thing to stress. Yes. So I hope you agree, because
I totally. Can I just add two thoughts to what you say, and it moves me that I was communicative to that degree, because I completely agree. Just two additional thoughts. One is that we all are aware, particularly in the United States, that the counter case that's always made is, well, there's an elitist, broadly speaking, left-wing establishment that is completely intolerant of disputing views. That's something that one hears all the time. And as with all half-truths, there's a half-truth to it. And one of our jobs as professors and writers and so on is to battle that in our own sphere all the time. If there was one lesson, and I intended to say this and forgot, that the 20th century taught us with all of its horrors, it's that we have to be equally hard on the authoritarian appetites of the right and on the totalitarian temptations of the left. So that's our obligation. And the only other thing I'd add about pluralism, about political pluralism, this is what I was trying to say, perhaps not clearly enough, is that the political pluralism needs an undergirding of social pluralism, of a pluralism of pleasures. That one of the best ways we educate ourselves in the values of pluralism is joining in a football team, or in my country, a baseball team, where you have to deal with people who are not like you and who come from a different background. And those institutions of coexistence, and where we learn pluralism as play, are in a sense preliminary to our understanding of political pluralism.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason the authoritarian leaders always go after civil society
yes,
too.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, this is happening in Sweden now. They're trying to kill off a traditional sort of civil society, parts of civil society.
Yes.
Definitely. So, and to the first point, yes. I mean, and that's a danger of thinking of this sort of Hegelian way of the,
yes,
right? It's like, oh, liberal democracy has won. We were right about everything, so you shut up. I mean, that was going on for a while.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And that is terrible. It's so damaging, and
that's what I call the Hegelian hangover.
It's a Hegelian hangover. Never believe in that. Never believe liberal democracy has won. It's over. But also, really don't believe liberal democracy has lost.
Yes.
I mean, Putin goes around saying liberal democracy is obsolete, right? That is also a very dangerous story that a lot of people are buying now. No, there's no story. There's us and what we do and our decisions.
Exactly.
But let me ask you, I mean, on a societal level, referring to Popper, how much should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? Where should we draw that line? I mean, that's not an easy question to answer, I think.
No, I mean, speaking of Popper.
Yes,
exactly.
Right.
Speaking of Popper.
Well, yes, exactly. You know, it's some of you, I'm sure, know Karl Popper phrased the paradox of tolerance. A liberal society has to be tolerant up to the point when it tolerates intolerance and then assassinates itself and dissolves itself. The way I would put it is that liberal societies are not neutral. And that was one of the themes of 1,000 Small Sanities that I wanted to emphasize. That a liberal society is not just a neutral game board on which we all play with the liberal as a kind of a gamekeeper in that way. It has a set of values. Now, those values are, to use the word of the evening, pluralistic. They're very broad, but they're not limitlessly expandable, and they're not nothing. Let me put one that's highly controversial directly, because let's be bold. The question of whether women should be veiled in public is a profound one, and you can make a perfectly reasonable case that it is one of the values of a liberal society that we address every individual as an individual, and that a veiled citizen is not a full citizen. That's just part of that's the values. If you want to participate in a liberal society, you have to accept that. I am well aware of the counter-arguments to that, and I respect them. But those are the places, the real places, where it isn't just nice talk, but it's really hard social decisions. And the only way we can do them is the way we do anything else. That is on the merits of the particular case, and that's what we have to focus on.
No, that's absolutely right. Right. I mean, the paradox that Popper was talking about, that he claims that at some point the tolerant society has to become intolerant to the intolerant. And it is true, but it is not easy to know what that point is, right? So is it there? Like you're suggesting, I don't know. And for me, where that arises right now, of course, is in the freedom of speech debate. That is, it seems to me, increasingly becoming the absolute focal point of everything right now, right? Because the anti-democratic propaganda that is really doing so much harm now, and I think is very much part of the explanation of why this sort of tribalism is bubbling up again. It's because the new information landscape really promotes tribalism in the worst possible way. And the worst parts of us are sort of fears and emotions and that are kind of harmful emotions. So in that situation, we also know this there's a ton of research on this now. It's 10 years that we've seen this. I've seen this research explode since I wrote my first book in 2016 on alternative facts. There's so much research on disinformation and propaganda and democracy, and we know it really goes hand in hand with autocratization. It is so harmful to democracy. Now, that is using free speech, right? So what do we do to should we limit free speech to save democracy? I think that is a genuine dilemma. I do think there are other ways of creating a saner information environment than by limiting freedom of speech. You can demand greater responsibility from the tech companies without limiting freedom of speech. But it is a debate we must be having, and we're not having that enough. The other side, and this goes with the oligarchy point, of course, because that world that we all live in, the information world we all live in, is owned by these people, these oligarchs, who are now kissing power.
Yes,
right?
who were not in quite the same way 20 years ago in the...
No, but not even these very same people in 5 years ago, right?
Yes,
they were, right? They were for, supporting the Democratic Party. Not all of them, but some of them were. And Bezos.
And again, let me emphasize, it's not that they're obliged to support the Democratic Party at all. They're obliged to participate in democracy. Just to add one thought quickly, is that I am a man of divided nations. I was raised in Canada and actually born in the States, but raised in Canada, live in the States now. And in Canada, of course, we have very strong hate speech laws. We actually do. There are things in Canada you cannot say. For instance, Holocaust denial in Canada, as in France, is a crime.
In Sweden now as well, I think. Yeah, I think that's been in...
Well, it's being discussed, but they haven't done it yet.
I'm not sure. No, okay.
But it's actually against the law in Canada. There's a remarkable Canadian justice, dear friend named Rosemary Abella, who authored that decision. There are some things you cannot say. Now, Canada is not, to my mind, a less free country than the United States because of those laws. On the other hand, it constrains speech, and those are places that we have to think about. The only other thing I'd add, and this is one of the points I was trying to make this evening, is that Canada has not escaped this crisis either at all. No. So that our notion that if we come up with the right piece of legislation, we're going to solve the problem, I think is optimistic but not realistic.
No, I think that's right, and that's one reason I don't think that the way forward is limiting freedom of speech.
Yes, right.
Because it won't work. Yeah. I mean, imagine that. So the most harmful lie of all the lies that Donald Trump has told is a lie about the election 2020.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Everything stems from there. The riots at the Capitol, all that, and all his rage and revenge desires now stem from him being sued because of the things. All of that comes from. So that lie. Now imagine that lie would have been forbidden. You couldn't spread a lie about election results. Imagine that was true. He would still have done it. Nothing would have happened. He would have been a martyr. There would have been court cases. It would have been too slow. It would not have saved democracy.
Well,
I think it just wouldn't. But on the other hand, to be philosophical, if we imagine a thought experiment where it would have saved democracy, it might have been right to do that, right? So we can imagine a situation where it would be okay to limit freedom of speech.
A utilitarian argument, in a sense, right?
Well, that is how the arguments go. Even John Stuart Mill thought we should have some limitations.
Yes, people forget that about Mill, but feel strongly about that. I don't mean to make our philosophical argument too parochial or provincial, but one of the undying reproaches to the Biden administration, I think, was exactly that they believed, as we liberals are sometimes inclined to, that if you simply go through the motions of liberal proceduralism, they will somehow magically resolve a crisis. And they ran away from the crisis of January 6th instead of addressing it directly and immediately. That would have required courage. It would have created another kind of crisis, but it could have actually have confronted the problem rather than retreated from it. It was heartbreaking. I did a piece about Germany in 1932, and it was heartbreaking to read about the Social Democrats in Germany in 1932, who basically thought, if we just keep repeating the shibboleths and rules of the Weimar Republic, they will magically somehow resolve the crisis. That's one of the weaknesses of institutionalized liberalism, is we believe in proceduralism and in good conduct to the point of madness.
Yes.
But can I ask you, I mean, are there situations where you, of pragmatic reasons, should limit freedom of speech? I mean, in Sweden, recently was the case when we tried to be a member of NATO.
Yes.
And Turkey said no.
Right.
And we had these Quran burnings, you know,
Right, yes.
in Stockholm and so on. And there were quite a few very secular voices saying that we should forbid that because it would make it easy to go into NATO and also of respect for the belief system and so on. Before you answer, I must tell you, I actually was surprised because I met this Muslim Salafist who told me about this. He said that burning a Quran is a normal thing we do when the family Quran is changed to a newer one. We burn it as in a ceremonial way. So the problem is not burning the Quran. The problem is when you do it to sort of
as a
protest thing. Anyway, I just thought that was a bit interesting.
That is. Well, we can simply change the valence and say it's the new.
But the true question is here: what do you think about a case like that? Pragmatic reasons.
I mean, there are always pragmatic reasons. There are limitations on freedom of speech. In Sweden, there's a big difference between saying you can never say this and saying, well, depending on the context, you may not be able to say this.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So when it comes, we don't have in Sweden anything that you can never say.
Yeah.
We don't have that like you do in Canada and Germany. I think that is kind of good because it should depend on the context. And then pragmatic sort of enters that way a little bit, right? Now, how harmful is it in this particular context to say that particular thing or do that particular thing? And when it comes to burning the Quran, you know, if you add some bacon on top and play some anti-whatever, which someone did here.
Yes.
He was actually sentenced for the equivalent of hate speech.
Hate speech, yeah.
Swedish. So I think it's good that it's contextual because then you can take these things into account. And that was John Stuart Mill's idea.
Yes.
He said you can say anything, but in a particular context where it threatens to become violent in a very bad way, that was his example, it's not okay to say this thing.
Yes.
So I think that's a way to do it, and you always have to bring in these sort of pragmatic considerations when you determine whether this is that kind of context.
Obviously, free speech ends when it becomes an invitation to violence. Burning the Quran or the Torah or whatever it is a complex question. Is this an invitation to violence, or is it a symbolic demonstration of a lack of reverence for something that someone else reveres, which seems central, that we should be able to mock our own religion or faith. The only thing I'd add to that, because I think it's important, we can focus on those difficult cases, and they are difficult cases, and it seems to me perfectly reasonable to say anybody who would go out of their way to deeply offend their fellow citizens about a point of piety strikes me as engaged in a counterproductive action. Is that, as a matter of fact, liberal societies like this one, like the United States as it was when I left, still, like Canada, are actually, as a matter of fact, incredibly good, uniquely good in human history, as I was trying to say tonight, in having a broadly pluralist embrace of religion. You know, that's something I can never understand. There are certain kinds of, particularly in the United States, of Catholic conservatives who say, our faith and our belief is under assault at every moment. And yet, you walk out on the streets of New York City on any Saturday morning and you encounter Hasidic Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Satmar, Lubavitcher, Catholics, on their way to church on a Sunday morning, Russian Orthodox on their way. It is simply not a true description of the world that liberal democracies have made, that they denigrate or undervalue religion. If the only way you can value religion is to accept its dominance and leave it completely unthreatened, then in that sense, they undervalue religion. But there is no intrinsic tension between accepting a broad variety and embracing a broad variety of faith and believing in freedom of speech and criticism.
But do I understand you correctly if I take these two examples? You would say that it should not be allowed to burn a Quran outside a mosque just to disturb the religious ceremony, but it would be okay to burn the Quran outside the Iran embassy in protest against the treatment of women.
I'm not going to discuss the particular case, but I'm saying it should be a
Why
matter
not?
of the particular case.
Yeah.
It should matter of the context, how harmful it is.
That's what I mean.
And we should be careful to add all sorts of things like, well, now we're talking this sort of additional like harm to the nation. I think that's a very dangerous path because that can be abused. So I don't think that was a good idea. But so it depends on what kind of harm you include. It's so far directed at harms to individuals and so on, right? But harm to the nation, not a good way to go.
I think we can use, and this is Mill's distinction too. It is not that difficult to make a distinction between a direct threat to a person and a symbolic action against an idea. We say, oh, well, that's a difficult case, but it really isn't. Most of the time we know, as with the Charlie Hebdo massacre, that's a direct series of threats to people. Drawing a cartoon, however offensive, is a desecration of an idea. They're two very different things, and I'm impatient with people who insist, oh, there's a short space between them. There really isn't. We know the difference.
Okay, another question about America. What were the mistakes that the Democratic Party did that led Trump to victory for the second time?
Do you have all night?
Yes? No, but I mean, in general, what were the mistakes? What kind of mistakes did they do?
There were tactical mistakes and strategic mistakes, ideological mistakes deeply rooted in the history of the Democratic Party, and practical mistakes.
Yeah, but take the ideological mistakes. What were they?
The first ideological mistake was to fall prey to the internal pressure groups of the Democratic Party, which have always been in place and involve everybody who is a friend of mine. The core tragedy of the Democratic Party is that the median voter in the United States is a white man in his 50s with a high school education. That's the median voter. And there was almost nothing done in something like the Democratic Convention to address that voter. I suspect most of you did not watch that convention, but I did, and it was full of good people and fine people, but that voter, who is the key voter, was left unaddressed. There was one great basketball coach, Steve Kerr, who addressed the convention on the second night at 10:30 at night. So not recognizing the realities of American politics, that's the voter you have to reach. And may I add, that's the voter who Barack Obama was very skilled at reaching, and in the first instance, Joe Biden was as well. Blinding yourself to that reality, that was a terrible mistake. Allowing your politics to be determined in advance by passionate pressure groups. We can debate the rights and wrongs of participation of transsexuals in sports and in other things, definitely. But this is, if I may say, and now I will say another taboo thing, this is a tiny problem. This is statistically and proportionally a very, very small problem. To allow it to balloon until it becomes a defining issue is the bad practice of politics.
Well, I mean, the Republicans wanted to make it a defining issue
exactly.
too, right?
But we shouldn't give them the...
No, exactly. If you give them a little bit,
yes, then they will
make it a big...
Then they will take a lot. And then, and then I think all of those things mattered. I think that what I said before, that the undue reliance on proceduralism and on legalism in things like the Trump cases was catastrophic. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, his own professor, Lawrence Tribe, who I did an event like this with before the election, said he was full of despair about him because he was so wrapped up in his own piety and his own role as a good judge and a fair man that he failed to recognize the scale and the enormity of the challenge before him. So that was a place, again, where proceduralism triumphed over principle, because principle comes at some cost in proceduralism.
Yeah, it took more than 2 years before he did anything about January 6th. And then it was too late.
And then it was too late.
Yeah.
So all of those things, I think, are part of it. And then again, the larger lesson, is that there's no crime in having the wrong person elected. That's just part of the system. The wrong person gets elected. The problem is when the wrong person doesn't want any more elections. That's the problem, right? We can debate. I think that the tariff policy of Trump is crazy and self-destructive. But tariffs have been part of American and of European life for a very long time. People can make all kinds of crazy policy decisions. I think the abandonment of Ukraine is obviously a bad idea. But I have sat down and spoken, as I'm sure you have too, with people who will tell you that it was a disaster that NATO didn't opened its arms to Ukraine. I don't agree with that, but that's a rational argument that we can have for good or ill. What we can't have, there is room for debate about everything except about having room for debate. And when we come up to the point where what's a threat is not my preferred policy positions, but the possibility of the persistence of politics at all, that's when it becomes terrifying. But if you want me to talk endlessly about everything that the Democratic Party did wrong, I can go on and on and on and on. And then just one last thought, because it's important too. The other thing, and this again speaks to 1932 in a tragic way, is the Democratic Party in the United States has become a kind of gerontocracy. The people who represent it are too old. Now, we saw the tragic disaster of Joe Biden persisting in trying to run when it was perfectly apparent to everyone that he was a worthy and good man who was simply too old to continue on. And the fact that he would not recognize it, and that the people around him would not recognize it, and the fact that the other key people in the party were also past the age of 80, that was in itself part of the tragedy of a fossilized progressive party. History will be very, very harsh on the people who did not have the courage to speak up and say, this will not work.
But there is another aspect here, which I don't know what you would think about, which is a fundamental dilemma when you have a presidential candidate who is saying, and it's very clear, if you just look a little bit at the people around him, and he's very explicit, that he will dismantle democracy.
Yes.
Now, you have that candidate in a democratic system. What does the other side do, right? They have two choices. They can pretend he's a normal candidate and debate policy, which is what you're supposed to do, because you're a good person and you're a good liberal and all that. And at the same time, that kind of makes for a false equivalence of the situation.
Yes.
That is really unacceptable. On the other hand, the dilemma is, if you say what's true is that if this guy wins, democracy will go under. That is problematic, because then you're not playing by the game, which you want to do. And I mean, that's what autocrats say about their opponents, that they are a threat to democracy, right? Are you going to say that? Well, I mean, you kind of should, because that person is a threat to democracy. But if you do say that, it sounds like you're the threat to democracy. It's a real dilemma. And for that reason, I think the saddest, the most tragic thing about this is that everything that's happening now, it was knowable beforehand that it was going to happen. He said it. You could read it in Project 2025. They've now implemented about 50% of the proposals in Project 2025, 900 pages long document. It was knowable, and yet there was nothing we could do to stop it.
If I may. If in the New Yorker magazine on October 8th, 2024, I wrote a long piece
I missed that one.
saying this is what will happen.
Right?
I guarantee you these things will happen.
right? It didn't help.
if he is elected. And inevitably, my stuff has, no purchase outside my readers. But I think if I ask why that obvious truth did not catch on, I think there are two reasons. One is straightforward. That is that I hate the word media, but the newspapers and television and people generally could not face that reality because it was too hard to face, and because all of our training lies in not facing it. The New York Times, and now I will lose the good opinion of my many friends there, has spent years normalizing and minimizing Trumpism, not because they are sympathetic to it in any way, but because all of the training of an American and a European journalist lies in not confronting a reality that is too hard, because then that puts you out on a propagandistic limb, which is the worst place you can possibly be.
Exactly.
So that's one problem. The other thing, and this is what I tried to articulate in that piece, and no one understood it at all because it was a sort of metaphysical idea, is that there's a very real divorce in the United States particularly, but I suspect it's broadly true in Europe now as well, between political acts and their resonance. There is a kind of, we are online so much of the time that the moment you go offline, the whole world vanishes in a certain way, the world of political debate. It has no real grasp on us. I gave the example that the basic way that American politics proceeds now is on podcasts. And that's the lingua franca of American politics, not television news, not newspapers, not magazines, it's podcasts. And the way podcasts work is that the podcaster has to do his own commercials, his own advertisements. So you would hear a right-wing podcast or a left-wing podcast, and the leading left-wing podcast was being sponsored by Men's Underwear, the Pod Save America. So he's saying, Trump is obviously going to implement Project 2025, and it will destroy American democracy. For one moment, let me talk about Tommy John underwear. Are you uncomfortable every day when you put your pants on? Tommy John underwear, and the same voices, right? Now, that's part of the capitalist system, we understand it, but it had the inevitable effect, that's a comic instance of it, of constantly disarming the intensity of our response to it. Because you say, well, it can't be that bad if they're still selling underwear. And that's part of the problem of the way of exactly the technology that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It distances us from the actual consequences. And then suddenly masked men show up in the streets throwing people into cars, and you say, oh, I didn't know that's what this was about.
That's right. And of course, the Democratic Party didn't dare go there either.
Yes.
They didn't dare say this because it didn't seem to pay off.
Yes.
Right. So there's that too. I mean, right now I'm really terrified because, and I see it in Sweden too, because now the claim is after the Kirk murder, which is horrific, the claim now is that if you call someone a fascist or if you call someone a threat to democracy, you're encouraging violence.
Yes.
And that is really a scary development because, of course, some people are fascist and some people are a threat to democracy. And if we can't call that out, what are we going to do?
And the reason you make that claim or you make that assertion is exactly to prevent violence. It's
to prevent violence, of course, but they have the best rhetoric now, and I think it's...
But that's, and it's, as you know better than I, it's perpetual truth of authoritarians, right? Is that they turn resistance to authoritarianism into terrorism, and we can't fall prey to that description, and it requires courage to do that, and it's a courage that is sadly lacking right now.
Yeah. Do you think there is a risk now after the killing of Charlie Kirk that Trump will implement new laws and sort of terror classify organizations?
Well, he did that today. He terror classified Antifa. Right?
Antifa,
which is not even an organization.
No,
actually.
it's not.
Which is not even an organization.
I mean, he's going after George Soros' Open Society Foundation. It's going to be like in Russia. They did that, right?
Or in Hungary, where they did where they took away the Open University. Look, the United States is a very large country with a high level of, what's the right word, subsidiary institutions. So it's relatively hard. It's not a tightly centralized country. So it's relatively hard to pursue those objects right through. The simple truth is that, I hardly need to say, nonviolent, peaceful social resistance to authoritarianism is on the whole remarkably successful. Not perfectly successful, but remarkably successful. Whenever you talk to people, and I'm sure all of you talk to them more often than I do even, who lived through the Eastern European experience and the Velvet Revolutions and so on, one of the things they say to you is that we did not know how much power we had because we were frightened of exercising it. And the moment we began to assert it, independent of the government, that's the point I was trying to make tonight, right? Not through our insertion into a political system, which in the Czech Republic or something was not you could not enter, but through creating alternative institutions, sometimes at enormous cost of persecution. I deeply believe that is still available to us. It's fascinating to me, I don't know how many of you here have followed it, but the Mandami campaign in New York City, you know, there's a young socialist who's running for mayor of New York.
Oh, yeah.
And all of my son's best friends are running the campaign, which terrifies me because these are kids, you know, who can't tie a bow tie without help. Nonetheless, that is the kind of movement, it's genuine, indigenous, non-corrupt social movement that's...
Totally. Or my daughter's best friend, so I have been campaigning for Mandani in New York. So he's got the young people enthusiastic for the first time in a long time.
Exactly.
And no, I mean, look, I think America is not Russia.
Yeah.
America has strong civil society and a strong tradition of all these liberal democratic institutions and media. And I think there's a lot of mobilization. So I do, and I think some things like Jimmy Kimmel thing, is not going to help Trump. People just become increasingly clear what's going on. And I think there's a lot of mobilization.
I so hope you're right about that. But
well, we have to say something hopeful too. But I do think that.
As I said tonight, I have been dispirited and discouraged and even at times despairing about the astonishingly quick secession.
It's been very fast.
Of American institutions.
Yeah.
Particularly American capitalist institutions that ought to know better. Because as I said tonight, it's not just that it's objectively wrong, it's bad for them. It's bad for them.
The law firms, that's shocking.
Exactly.
My husband is a lawyer, he's been shocked by this.
But
universities.
But you think there is a more radical resistance needed in this situation?
I don't think there's. I think there needs to be more broadly. There needs to be a broadly based coalition of people who believe in the Constitution. One of the encouraging things about American life in the past 8 years is that there have been plenty of once hardbound conservatives who understand that, and come my fellow Canadian David Frum, and I could list have a long list, with whom I agree about nothing except the only essential thing. And building a coalition of people who agree about nothing except the one essential thing is, I think, part of the task at hand. And, it's, as I tried to say tonight, the oligarchic secession is a source of deep, deep worry and anxiety and concern. That I don't think it's too far gone yet. And I think that the degree to which, as you were saying, the degree to which it's all perfectly apparent. In other words, we can speak and say, because we see what it is. But it is it is an unusually I don't want to say demoralizing. We shouldn't be demoralized. It is an unusually threatening time. But to come back to the theme of my talk tonight, it is always an unusually threatening time. And I'm old enough to remember I honestly can remember the 1950s and early 1960s when democracy was doomed because communism was so much more militant and strong. I can remember I was a block from the World Trade Center on 9/11, and I remember having to make the case, no, democracy is not decadent, because remember how many people were saying then, democracy is too decadent and Islamic militants will sweep the world, and that turned out to be false. democracy in the 1930s, which I don't remember, but I have read about as you have, as we all have, when it's hard to remember now that in the 1930s, the consensus of intellectuals in Europe was that parliamentary democracy, Millian democracy, was doomed, that history would either take, in its Hegelian way, the path of left-wing totalitarianism or right-wing authoritarianism, and the few people who spoke up for the democratic tradition were seen as eccentric or out of date. We sometimes tend to forget, and I say this as a semi-patriotic French adoptee, how isolated de Gaulle was as a Catholic conservative in France who nonetheless was resolutely anti-Nazi. There weren't 20 generals like that. There was one. All the others had already made their deal. So at every moment in history, not just democracy, but liberal democratic values seem doomed. So far, they've rebounded and revived. That's no proof that they will again, but it's a hopeful, inductive sequence.
I think they will rebound because they just is a better society that they create, right? People, a lot of this, when you see young people, they think, large groups of young people think an autocracy would be better. And I'm like, do you know what it's like to live in an autocracy? Do you have any inkling if you think that? People then discover it is not fun. So I think in the end, because liberal democracy creates the best kind of society, not a perfect society, but like you were saying, the best, it will.
I hope that's
true. But
true.
there might be an ice age in between. Who knows?
It could be. You know, I always think that's one of my favorite details of American movies. In Stanley Kubrick's great movie Spartacus, about the slave revolt, the time, it ends by saying that though Spartacus was killed, the movement for human emancipation he began did not end. What they don't add is it took another 2,000 years before
but let me just
ask
you before we finish. I mean, we've talked a lot about America now, but I mean, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, these illiberal tendencies, you have them in Europe, you have them in India with Narendra Modi.
With Modi, and absolutely.
And still it's very different cultures, and you have them in Russia, obviously. How come that it's all simultaneously happens globally in very different cultures? What is the common thing here?
New information environment.
Sorry?
New information environment. That's it. That's the common thing.
So technology and internet.
It's not economic inequality, because that's not true of all countries. It's not immigration. Hungary has no immigration. It's the new information environment. That's throughout. That's in every country in the entire world, no matter how developed it is or is not.
Yeah.
And it drives exactly this tribalism, this thing, this emotional thing that is so harmful to... One way to put it that I sometimes do is that if we were to create an information environment that was maximally harmful to liberal democracy, this will be it. This is it. And if we wanted to create an information environment that was maximally helpful to populism, anti-pluralism, this will be it. So there we are. That's the situation we're in now. And unless we fix that, unless we improve that, make it less poison, less tribalistic, and less emotionally driven, it's going to be really hard to do anything about it.
I find that persuasive, but I would add only to it a somewhat more gloomy and cosmic and fatalistic note. And that is, my favorite writer is Albert Camus, and everyone has read, and I'm sure in this room, La Peste, the plague, as it's known. And rather comically, during the pandemic, it sold extremely well, though it's not about pandemics at all. It has nothing to do with plagues. What it's about is how, in any society, suddenly a virus can appear. And suddenly, the whole of a society is thrown upside down. And we are confronted with the most fundamental existential moral choices. And Camus' point is, you don't know where the plague came from. We don't know what made it happen. It appears. All we can do is respond to it. And what our obligation, as with the people in the book, in the novel, is to respond to it with all the moral resources that we have. I find this persuasive, but I don't know why this has happened. I do know that it's a plague, and I do know that our job in a plague is to be conscious of our fellow sufferers and to seek for a cure.
So let's bring in Sisyphus too then.
Yes.
Right. We need to pull that thing up again.
And
Camus said, we must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Even though he never will be, but we are.
We keep pulling it up.
we keep pushing the boulder up the hill, and all we can ask for is fellow pushers.
Fellow pushers. That's right.
Okay, our time is actually out. So thank you so much for this discussion, and thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure always.
Good night.